This presentation will go over issues of gender and sexuality while studying abroad. Specific topics covered include gender norms and sexual identity abroad. Within each topic, we will provide guiding questions encouraging you to research your host country, points to reflect on, and available resources. Coming from a position of global power such as the United States means that we have the ability to exert this power and cultural influence both positively and negatively in the places we visit. Before traveling, ask yourself, what gender and sexuality norms exist in the United States and how do they impact me individually? More important, think about how stereotypes, race, gender, and sexuality in the U.S. shape your perceptions of these issues. These reflections and prejudices will be different for each of us based on our own experiences of gender and sexuality, race, citizenship, and other intersecting identities. They might also affect the way you decide to meet friends and date if you choose to do so while abroad. We'll begin with gender norms. Gender norms are a set of rules or ideas about how each gender should behave. They are not based in biology, but instead determined by a culture or society. For these reasons, it is important to consider your host country's cultural attitude towards gender compared to your own experiences in your home country. Depending on where you are, you may find different gender roles and norms than you're used to, and may be treated differently or be expected to treat others differently based on these factors. When researching gender norms in your host country, remember that it is important to be aware of how your perceptions of gender are influenced by U.S. societal and cultural norms. Questions around attitudes, stereotypes, and political and social power, and how these might interact with your presence as a student from the U.S. are a good way to get started. Preparing for differences in gender norms will help you determine the role this may play in how you develop interpersonal connections. Keep in mind that the influence of U.S. gender and dating norms will influence communication in your host country. Learning about gender relations and reflecting on your behavior accordingly is an important factor in relating to another culture. However, you do not need to be complicit with what is viewed as acceptable behavior in your host country if it is offensive or makes you uncomfortable. Always make sure to analyze societal expectations with your own personal values and how those values influence your perception of what is acceptable in your host country. Consider this quote from one student who studied abroad in Uganda. Sexual identity encompasses how one thinks of oneself in terms of to whom one is romantically or sexually attracted. It may also refer to sexual orientation identity when someone identifies or disidentifies with a sexual orientation. Consider how your sexual identity and U.S. perceptions of sexuality may influence your relationships within your host country, your cultural adjustment, and your overall study abroad experience. Now that we've looked at both sexual and gender identity, let's compare to ensure we understand the difference. Sexual orientation refers to an inherent or immutable enduring emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people. Gender identity refers to one's innermost concept of self as male, female, a blend of both, or neither, how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. One's gender identity can be the same or different from their sex assigned at birth. Gender expression refers to the external appearance of one's gender identity, usually expressed through behavior, clothing, haircut, or voice, and which may or may not conform to socially defined behaviors and characteristics typically associated with being either masculine or feminine. As part of your research, familiarize yourself with sexuality norms and the LGBTQIA+ climate in your host country. Will you feel comfortable challenging any norms you disagree with? How safe will that be? Societal expectations based on sexuality and sexual identity can differ between countries and can influence interaction. In some cultures, Western understandings of gay and straight don't exist or don't carry the same importance as they do in the US. People involved in same gender relationships may not see this as an identity. In other cultures, there are active social movements for sexual and gender minorities. Regardless of your identity, it is important to research the LGBTQIA climate of your host country and to also consider how U.S. perceptions of sexuality may differ. The laws governing sexual activity and LGBTQIA relationships differ from country to country. You may also find strong communities, activist organizations, or resources for LGBTQIA travelers or residents of your host country, and it is great to familiarize yourself with these as well. Here is another perspective from a student who studied in Edinburgh, Scotland. Northwestern's Gender and Sexuality Resource Center works to provide a safe and affirming space for all members of the NU community, including during their time abroad. Additionally, visit the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association at ilga.org. Another great resource are your peers. Talk to Global Learning Office ambassadors and other returnees who studied in your host country to gauge what typical behavior looks like and to ask about their experiences navigating gender norms abroad. To recap, research gender and sexuality norms in your host country. Consider how U.S. perceptions of sexuality and gender could bias your understanding of these issues in your host country, and reach out to resources on campus such as CARE, the Women's Center, and GLOW ambassadors.